Okay.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining today. I'll hand over to Tracy to do apologies for absence.
I'll do apologies,
Oh,
Chair. Yeah, we've got apologies this morning from Michaela Jones and from Councillor Phil Crayford, and Councillor Oliver James has given his apologies. He might be a bit late to join us though.
That's fine. Thank you very much. Okay. Can I ask for any disclosures for personal or prejudicial interest? Anybody need to declare? No? No, thank you very much. And then item 3, we have minutes for the 19th of March. Has everybody had a chance to read through them, please? Anything that I need to amend, or can I have approval if that's okay? Do you want to just put hold your hands up? That's fine. Okay, full approval on that one. And then the second minutes would be for Wednesday, the 30th of June. Again, have you had a chance to read through those minutes? Yes? And is there any amendments that need to be brought? If not, can you approve them? That's fine. Thank you very much. Also approved. Okay, so item 4 is going to be the Ombudsman for Wales annual report, and I think Tracy
Yes,
can do that.
Thank you, Chair. So agenda item 4, which is at page 10 of the bundle, is the Public Serviceman's Ombudsman for Wales annual report entitled Delivering Justice 2020 to 2021. It's quite a lengthy report. The bulk of it is taken up dealing with the complaints against public authorities. But if I can just draw your attention to page 32 of the report, and it's page 45 of the bundle. And that's where the Ombudsman starts talking about code of conduct complaints. Surprisingly, during the pandemic, the code of conduct complaints actually rose by 47%, with a total of 535 new complaints being made. Of those, the Ombudsman investigated 308 complaints. It is perhaps surprising because in general, complaints against public bodies actually fell. It was complaints under the Code of Conduct that did actually increase. The largest complaints are made against community and town councillors. They increased by 23.7%. And the increase in complaints against county and county borough councils, that also rose, but it may be partly explained by the fact that there were 35 complaints against one councillor. I'd also draw your attention in particular to the reference by the Ombudsman where he talks about that he's still seeing a considerable number of frivolous and tit-for-tat complaints. These complaints tend to be driven by political rivalry or just simply a clash of personalities between councillors or town and community councillors. And he does strongly recommend that in those circumstances that councillors take up the appropriate training. In terms of categorisation of the complaints, because I'm sure you'd be quite interested in this, they are set out at page 33 of this report or page 46 of the bundle. And you'll see there that, again, by far the largest category for complaints is under the promotion of equality and respect. 55% of the complaints related to a failure to comply with that part of the code. That is an increase from the previous year. 14% related to disclosure and registration of interest, which is a slight decrease from the previous year, and 12% related to integrity, which is again a slight increase from the previous year. But there does seem to be an annual increase in the number of complaints that the Ombudsman is receiving relating to bullying behaviour. Also, I'm sure you'll be interested in the part of his report where he talks about how many of his complaints were investigated and how many were closed after initial investigation. 92% of complaints that the Ombudsman received were closed after an initial assessment, and using against the two-stage test. Some of the complaints were actually withdrawn. The remaining 8% were investigated, and those that represented the most serious of the complaints received were referred to the Standards Committee or to the Adjudication Panel for Wales. 10 were actually referred to the Standards Committee or Adjudication Panel, 6 were referred to the Standards Committee, and 4 were referred to the Adjudication Panel for Wales. But that actually represented a 100% increase in the previous year. I don't think there's much more to add to that. There is one case I will flag it when we come to the Code of Conduct casebook, but you will note that in relation to the complaints that were referred to the Adjudication Panel for Wales, there were 2 fairly hefty suspensions of 7 and 15 months applied. And then just finally, the Ombudsman does touch upon the Local Government and Elections Wales Act, and he welcomes the additions to the ethical framework that legislation brings, in particular the duty on the group leaders in relation to standards of conduct and making sure that they promote and maintain high standards of conduct by group leaders and their group parties. And also, just to remind you that we are under a duties and standards committee to take an annual report to full council, which we already do, but that report should be taken as soon as reasonably practicable after the end of the financial year. So it may be that we need to look at timetabling our annual report to bring it forward earlier in the year. So I don't think there's anything else that I wish to raise. I'm probably remiss of me not to point out that I think it's at page 162, where the Ombudsman is one of the appendices, Appendix E, I think it is, but the Ombudsman has set, yes, it is page 162, the Ombudsman has set out there in a table for the Code of Conduct complaints which relate to Swansea Council and to the Town and Community Council Code of Complaints, and you see there were 19 complaints against Swansea Council, 8 were discontinued, 9 there was no evidence of breach, and 1 was withdrawn when no action necessary. And then in relation to Mumbles Community Council, you'll see that there's a total of 3, 1 no evidence, 1 where there's no action necessary, 1 was withdrawn, and 1 was referred to the Standards Committee, which you'll be familiar with, and then 3 Crosses Community Council, 1 was discontinued. So that is a summary of the Code of Conduct complaints that were received in relation to the Swansea area during 2020 and 21. So I don't think there's anything further. It's quite a lengthy report, but as I say, it primarily deals with complaints against public bodies, but there is, as always, a section in there about the Code of Conduct complaints.
Thank you. May I ask you a question?
Certainly.
I can't remember what the full title is. The Swansea, where it can be taken locally. It used to be a complaint that we had.
We have a local dispute resolution process, yes, which still has not been used.
I was going to say, so therefore that has not been used. Fine. I want to know. Thank you very much. Anybody else want to ask Tracy anything? Yes, sorry, Mike, I can see your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I suppose just for completeness, apologies, Chair, I perhaps should have declared an interest in this item to the extent that for the period covered, I was actually an independent member of Howell Health Board. So I know we focused today on the local authority complaints, and rightly so, but for completeness, I should have declared that. Apologies that I'm no longer a member of that health board, but I was up until 31st of March 2021. So apologies, I should have referred to that. And I think the only other thing I'd want to say, Chair, and at the risk of rehearsing things we've said on a number of occasions, whilst the ideal would be that we wouldn't see any complaints coming through, at least I'm pleased to see that where I think it was the 8% that required further investigation, I am pleased to see the increase in those being referred back to the Local Standards Committee. As we've said on a number of occasions, this committee has an important role to play, and so I am pleased to see that there's perhaps a change in that percentage.
Thank you very much. I can't see anybody else's hand up. Anybody else wanted to comment further? No? No.
And Chair, that report is just for information, so it's placed before you as it is on an annual basis.
Yes, thank you very much. Fine. In which case then we'll go on to item 5, which is our standards annual report.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm happy to introduce this report. There is a recommendation there that you review the Standards Committee annual report, approve it, and it will be forwarded to Council for information, and I'm sure the Chair will be turning up at Council to go through it. It was scheduled to go to our Council in November, but because we have quite a hefty agenda for that Council meeting, it's been slipped back to the December Council meeting. Can I initially thank Alison for all the work that she's put into this? We thought we'd look at revamping the whole of the annual report this year. So we looked around, we looked at reports that we quite like from other local authorities, and we decided that we'd sort of beef it up a little bit. And you can see right at the end we've got biographies of all the members of the Standards Committee, and we also have included reference to the terms of reference. We've got a Chair's forward, which is on page 169. And then we set out the work that the Standards Committee has done during the past year. Has been a difficult year. Many committees have reduced their workloads, but I think you'll probably agree that this committee has actually achieved quite a lot during the course of the year. And it was pleasantly surprising when myself and Alison were putting together the report that we had so much to actually put in it. So we've outlined the work that has been undertaken on page 171. We've accounted for the fact that we didn't actually meet with the political group leaders, but we did have a session on feeding back, outlining the themes and issues raised during the meetings. We also talk about the hearings procedure work that we did, and that's not to be underestimated actually, because that was a huge piece of work, and we actually did have to implement that procedure, and I would like to think that it worked fairly well, bearing in mind it was the first time that we had actually used it. And then we talk about the various investigations that the Ombudsman has undertaken, and the reports for information, including the Ombudsman Code of Conduct casework and Adjudication Panel for Wales. If I can just highlight to you as well on page 173, we have got future priorities, and I know a later agenda item is about our future work plan. But we have got in there that we do for the forthcoming year, we do need to look at whether we interview group leaders again, particularly in light of the duty under the Local Government and Elections Wales Act. So it may be that the committee feels that we should try, and it is going to be difficult because we have got local government elections next year, but it may be a piece of work that you want to consider undertaking in light of that duty on group leaders, to ask them how they are planning on going complying with that. Also, and again, this came out of the standards hearing that you were part of, and it was Margaret Williams that actually raised this about whether or not we wanted to look at writing and liaising with community councils as to what actual training they do undertake, particularly around financial matters. And then one piece of work that I'd quite like to do is updating the request for dispensation form. So I've just highlighted those in the annual report. It is something that we'll have a fuller discussion about at the end when we look at our work plan going forward. So all in all, I'm hoping that you like the new layout of the report. I think it certainly looks a lot better. But I have nothing further to say, but it is for you to decide whether you're happy with this to go to council, or whether there's anything you want taken out, or whether there's anything you want added.
If I may then, for those that have really taken a moment to say, does the report reflect what needs to be spoken about, or do you think in any way perhaps we've missed something? Does anybody have any burning issues that they wish to flag up, please? No. No? No. No.
So there is a recommendation on page 164, so we will need to put that to a vote to make sure that you are. Sorry, Margaret, you indicating that you wanted to speak? sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry about that, and apologies for the late arrival in the meeting as well, but that's another matter. Anyway, I just wanted to say you expressed thanks to Alison, but I think on behalf of the rest of the committee as well, I'd like to put forward formally thanks to you, Tracy, for this work that you've undertaken. And I think certainly I was encouraged when I actually saw the report, and I hadn't thought that much had been done until I read the report, but I must say it was quite heartening, and so I'd like to formally record really thanks to you for all the hard work that has been done, and the other officers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. Yes. Mike, did you want to make comment?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Well, firstly, to support and endorse what Margaret has said, but very specifically, Tracy, the work that you did with us and for us on the procedure, which, as I say, we always prefer not to use these things, but we did have to use it a couple of months ago, and I think it stood that test. So specifically, I want to endorse what Margaret has said, but specifically the work that you did on our procedure. Thank you.
Thank you for that. It is very much a team effort, so but I am grateful very much. Thank you.
And I was going to wait until everybody else commented, but in fact, absolutely, and I think that particularly the Ombudsman and their team, we were almost like being held under the microscope to see how our process and so much of what you put in place made that seem as if it was seamless. So yes, it made us very professional. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Positive feedback.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So there is a recommendation at page 164. We will need to take a vote on that. So all in favour, if you could raise your hands or your virtual hands for the report as it presently stands going to council. That's unanimous.
Unanimous. Thank you. Okay. Fine. Thank you, Mike. It's frozen. Or yes, it looks like his picture's frozen.
Yeah, I think it's frozen.
We'll move on to item 7.
6. Agenda item 6.
Oh, so I do beg your pardon. I thought we'd done that. Code of conduct.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Quite a full code of conduct casebook this time. I'm not going to actually dwell on any of the cases at the front of the report. The one case I would like to refer you to is the one on page 191, and it's the Surrey and Lavernock Community Council report that was dealt with by the Adjudication Panel for Wales. It may be that I'll bring a separate report on this because it is quite interesting, or it may be that we want to think about it in terms of work going forward. But just in a nutshell, it's worth a read of this report on the Adjudication Panel for Wales website. It involved a community councillor who I think actually did resign prior to this matter getting to the Adjudication Panel for Wales. And the allegations against the councillor were that he brought the office into disrepute for 3 Facebook posts between 10th of January and 11th of March 2019, which were, I'm not going to talk about them because they were particularly violent. They were gratuitous in relation to violence, and they talked about methods of killing very high-profile Labour politicians. It went to the Adjudication Panel for Wales, and the reason I'm raising it is because there's a very interesting discussion contained in the full, fairly lengthy case judgment around the freedom of expression and your Article 10 human rights and necessary limits of your Article 10 rights. But in this particular case, the Adjudication Panel for Wales did find that they had to balance your Article 10 rights, or the Council's Article 10 rights, with the extreme nature of these particular posts. And they concluded that on balancing the Article 10 rights, that it was only right that the councillor was actually disqualified for 15 months. So quite a hefty sanction, and it is worth I think if you do have time, it's quite a lengthy judgment, but if you do have time, it's definitely worth a read. It's quite an interesting case, but it does highlight the perils of social media for councillors, I think, and I think it's something that I probably will look at actually highlighting to our councillors and community councils, something that they need to be aware of what they're posting, because part of the defence was, well, Facebook didn't take it down, so it couldn't have been that bad. And was I actually acting in my capacity as a councillor, or was I acting in my private capacity? So there were quite interesting arguments around that. I should also add, the other thing I found quite interesting about this case was that there was a secondary allegation in there that the councillor concerned had actually failed to comply with Ombudsman's request in relation to the actual hearing. So again, that was another interesting strand, but I think, you know, the reason I wanted to highlight it was because it does very much demonstrate the perils of social media for councillors. That was the only case that I thought I'd highlight in any detail.
No, I think you're absolutely right. We live in a case of whereby freedom of expression, but with it you have to be very, very guarded for your responsibilities. No, I agree. Does anybody else just want to make any comment or observation, please? If not, we'll move on. No? Okay, thank you. So, in which case we're on to number 7, which is the breach code of conduct. Again, Tracy, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Agenda item 7, I don't propose to say anything again. This is the usual report we place in front of you, so that it sets out what cases have been referred to the Ombudsman and the stage of whether or not they've been investigated or whether they've been withdrawn, etc. I don't have anything further to add to that. It's just there for your information.
The report is there, yes. Okay. Anybody else wish to comment? No? Thank you. So, okay, item number 8 is really what you were talking about, Tracy, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it's the work plan that we really need to discuss now going forward, and I am conscious that, again, as we've already highlighted, it would be good to actually deal with a number of matters before we have to take the next annual report, so that we can demonstrate that we've been doing quite considerable work in terms of our terms of reference. So I was thinking about this last night, and I've just highlighted for myself 4 things that you may wish to consider. I would like to amend the dispensation form. Our dispensation form doesn't actually contain an awful lot of detail, and I think it's quite difficult for councillors to actually look at that form and to know quite what they're supposed to be filling in. So I'd like to pad out that form, rejig the form and bring it back to the Standards Committee for your approval, and we'll start using that going forward, hopefully next year, in terms of councillors seeking dispensation. So that's one piece of work I'd like to do, and perhaps update the guidance around dispensations as well. Secondly, again, going back to the standards hearing and Margaret's point about, well, do we need to start looking at what training community councillors get, particularly around financial matters, whether or not you may think that at this stage what we could do is write out to the clerks of the community council as town community councils, asking them what financial training their members have, and maybe seeking some sort of feedback as to what training across the board they offer. Yeah. So we can do that, we can arrange for the letters to be sent out, and it may be that we'll coordinate all the responses and then bring the response back to you, and that's a separate piece of work that you can perhaps look at. Thirdly, whether or not we look to speaking with the group leaders, as we've done previously, whether we start that off or whether we might want to put that back until after the local government elections next year. That's quite a difficult one, actually, for me, whether we embark on it now or we wait until after the election. And then, as I've just said, I highlighted that Sully and Mavenot case to you. Another piece of work I'd like to do is maybe put something together to send out to councillors around the perils of social media, because I think probably now is about the right time to start looking at that whilst we're coming up to a local election next year.
Yes. So on those 1 to 4 work plan, how would that sit within the proposed amending of issuing our report? Because you said we're going to have to tie it in now. So are we asking too much for that to be done within this new schedule?
I don't think we are, Chair. I have noted, and I spoke to Alison earlier on actually, I have noticed that our next meeting is the 18th of March.
Yeah.
We may need to think about putting an additional meeting in, possibly in January, beginning of January sometime, because otherwise I think it's quite a long gap until March.
Yeah.
I'd certainly like to feed back, to get the letters out to community councils and then feed back to the committee prior to March. And also the social media piece of work, I'd like to bring that back as soon as possible, really. So maybe either December or January, look at adding an additional meeting in. And that's subject to anything that you think you might wish to consider as well. So they were just my thoughts.
Okay, sorry, Mike, did you want to comment on?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm comfortable with the vast majority of what Tracy has said, as usual. I would be, I suppose I'm just reflecting on the best time that we sit down with the various party leaders. I'm sure my councillor colleagues will say that between now and the actual election itself will actually be quite a very busy time. So that doesn't make it any less important that we speak to them. But I don't know whether whether now is the best time. But I would absolutely say that once the new council is in place, and potentially there could be new councillors elected next year, who knows, that have never been on the council before, it would be absolutely imperative that we then speak to the party leaders after the election. But I'm open to others' views as to whether we try to do that as well before the election. The only other observation I've got, Chair, is in item 7 that we just looked at briefly. I'm just reflecting that the number of complaints in this period against community councillors appears to outweigh local authority councillors. And I know we never get to see the detail, and rightly so, but I just wonder whether Tracy could or Alison could look to see whether there are any trends amongst the community councillors that we could pick up from a training viewpoint.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes, I agree. The other Mike Lewis, please.
Yes. Although I agree with the other Mike Lewis, we should look to have the leaders come in after. I do feel we possibly, because this is the end of the term we're in now, we should have them before the election, so they can pass on to their members the complexities of the election and what they should and shouldn't, their members should or shouldn't do when we're in Purda, and to keep them aware of and keep the standard up of what they should and shouldn't do prior to the next election and during the next election. I don't know if Hugh could come in on this, but he's the expert. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
I nothing to add there.
I think, sorry Chair, if I can say something, I think there is merit in speaking to them before the election, because I will certainly need to give them a briefing as to what will be expected of them going forward. So it may then be that having to attend before the Standards Committee, and again it may come down to timing actually as to when we can do it, but to actually having them think about, having the group leaders think about it, be aware of this duty, and to actually start gearing up for it before the election, as Councillor Mike Lewis has pointed out, might actually be advantageous. It's just a question of whether we can fit it all in, I think, in what, possibly a meeting in January, possibly a meeting in March, but we can try and do our best.
Well, I'm glad that you said that, because I was fearful of saying, is that too much to expect? But I totally agree with you, Mike, totally agree. If it's at all possible, yes. Thank you. Okay.
So are we all agreed then that we'll try and set up meetings with group leaders around their duty and what they're proposing to do? We'll write letters to community councils about training.
Yeah.
I'll draft something around social media, referring in particular to any code of conduct casebook cases. We'll also work on the dispensations, and we'll pick up trends for the community council. Okay.
Okay. Yes. Oh, Margaret. Sorry, Margaret.
Hello. The only thing that I would like to add is that if we do have meetings with them, and I can see the merit in that, I think the agenda for that meeting needs to be looked at, because I think the questions that we had previously have sort of, well, most of them anyway, are not really suitable at this stage. And I don't know if it's going to cause too many problems, but I think any meeting with them needs to be focused particularly on the relevant issues leading up to the election, and the the issue of the social media, which I think is really important, and what their views are on that. But I mean, I'm aware that if we're going to have meetings to actually decide what they're going to be asked, I mean, but certainly personally I'd be happy for Tracy and Hugh to sort of work something out on that. But I did feel that the old questions had outlived their usefulness and were a bit too rote and pat, and weren't really getting us to the point where we ought to be. Thank you.
A point well made, Margaret. Thank you. Thank you.
And it may be actually that we just need to ask them, this is your duty.
Yeah.
How are you going to ensure that you maintain high standards within your group? And just leave it as simple as that. It doesn't need to be a lengthy meeting where we have 10 prescribed questions that we ask them about. So,
yeah, I think that's very relevant. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. Okay. So, any other questions to be raised? No. Fine. Okay.
the agenda.
Yes. So in that case, I'll call the end to the meeting. And we will await Tracy coming up perhaps with a January or whatever date. And then I think that's a really good way to work forward. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for attending. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.